the most obvious place to begin is just your background and how you entered composing and any other biographical details you'd like to share.
The uh, the thumbnail sketch and stuff that is not as easy to find online about me is that I grew up in the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Housing Project in the Bronx, which was a working class area, and all my people are essentially immigrants from Eastern Europe. Um, and even though uh, we didn't have much money, there was always a great respect for music and culture in this family. And my aunt was a singer. Um, she sang folk music and pop music, but she herself couldn't read music, which was not untypical of the environment that I grew up in. And I took to music very early as a kid, and some of the earliest pictures of me are pictures playing even fake instruments, drums and guitars and so on. Um, and I began to sing, and my first experience as a musician where I learned to read music and become acquainted with music outside the folk music tradition was by playing the guitar, which is strange because I had wanted to play the guitar because I thought of it as a folk instrument, but my parents, who were very concerned about getting me an instrument of any kind and not having a teacher, that's kind of an old world European thing. You had to have a teacher. Found a guy who taught guitar in this with a pick. And the guy in the neighborhood who taught that was a Russian immigrant himself. And he had me playing and reading excerpts from Russian ballets and operas and things that I really didn't know anything about on the guitar. And I wasn't particularly interested in them either. I wanted to do something like the Everly Brothers or Elvis Presley or Chuck Berry or somebody. But as a result of that, I really got more and more interested in music. And by the time I was about 11, I started to figure out that you could write certain things down that you were thinking about musically. And then the story is actually much more easily told. I learned to play flute and then oboe in junior high. And then I went to the High School of Music and Art, which is now LaGuardia School of the Arts. It's a free public high school with specialization in music and drama and the arts. And it was there that I did very well in theory, even though I wasn't really trained in it, but I did okay in it, and such that they allowed me to become part of a special class in music composition. So by the time I was 13 or 14, I was actually being supervised with other very talented young people in writing music. And I, you know, starting then at about that age, 14, 15, I never stopped from that point on. And the rest of my career from music and art, eventually to the University of Hartford, where I was at the Hart School of Music, and then Stanford University, and in a Fulbright to Vienna to study. I had originally gone to study with Ligeti, and then Ligeti came to Stanford. He became my personal teacher and my doctoral advisor. And that's pretty much the beginnings of my work in as a composer. And just to give a frame to folks, this would have been, into high school by 1960, out to Stanford by 1967. And then I taught in the Conservatory of Music in San Francisco, and then later at Yale. And I've been at Yale for a very long time now, since that time, teaching composition and continuing to compose lots of different kinds of music.
Yeah, in my research preparing for this interview, I discovered you have a very eclectic background musically. Although oh, go ahead. Sorry.
One of the things that my better teachers in composition really helped me to come to grips with was the idea that of musical composition as a kind of self-expression, not merely a desire to keep up with a fad of some kind or to become famous for a certain thing or other thing. And as a result of that, there's a kind of restlessness in my oeuvre, the background of my work, where I've tried a lot of very, very different things with a kind of inner confidence that no matter how different they may seem on the outside, on the inside, they would still very much represent a very personal take on what music is and music can be. Uh, yeah, so eclectic might be one word, diverse, uh, yeah, restless. I've been in a lot of different places musically.
And it's interesting that you said that your first experience with music was vocal. Because
That's
my
true.
my understanding is that you wrote My Friend's Story relatively late in your career.
That's quite true. I mean, I wrote other vocal music, but I had never written anything like an opera until I wrote my friend's story. Uh, I guess the opportunity never particularly arose to do such a thing, even though I had interest in doing it. A and B, um, I myself had been a singer, a pop singer, a folk singer, and all throughout my career, I sung in chorus. At summer camp where I was hired to play oboe and wait on tables. That's the only way I could do it. I was a waiter, you might say a singing waiter. I uh, I sang in numbers of productions, including solo bass parts and Haydn and other things. So, you know, I've been involved with vocal music my whole life. And at Stanford, I also played and sang in a rock band where I was first a lead singer and then a secondary singer because not too many bass baritones are lead singers in rock bands. They usually want a higher male voice than that for sure. Yeah, so my friend's story uh, came to me to do that work, um, I was, you know, kind of eager and ready and felt comfortable in the world of vocal music.
And I think that's reflected in the music itself. Of course, I've only prepared Jacob's song, but it feels very comfortable in the voice to sing. It's very comfortably placed. And
Yeah, and it's funny. The person I worked so closely with as the librettist, my now departed friend Sandy McClatchy, or J.D. McClatchy, as he's sometimes known. Sandy and I were very comfortable with the idea that we weren't workshop artists. I mean, a lot of people in this genre will develop their ideas and transform what they're doing in workshop after workshop after workshop to achieve what they want. And I think that's very good. I mean, when you have the opportunity to do that, that can be fine. But many chances to do this don't always include that extra time and money for such a thing. But neither Sandy nor I was anxious about the idea that we would have to get it right the first time. And so it was a kind of a kind of quiet triumph for me when people told me over and over again, well, you're going to have to alter the vocal parts. You know, singers have very particular needs, and you know, it's not at all uncommon to have to rewrite an aria or rewrite a passage or this and so forth and so on. And for whatever it's worth, I never had to change anything as a result of somebody saying, you know, no, this doesn't work for the voice. So yeah, I feel very comfortable with that, which is not to say that I did not, having written something, go back and fix it from a dramatic point of view, you know, and you know, writing kind of question. But to more to the point of your question, yeah, I think the vocal parts they kind of flow naturally out of where they are situated, and they shape themselves around the text in a way that's persuasive and understandable.
and that begs my next question, actually. How does your relationship with the librettist in the composition process work? Does the text come first and you write around it, or vice versa, or is it just a back and forth process?
I would say it's a mixture of all of those things. Sometimes there would be I'd have a musical stretch, uh, but since there was a very shaped storyline that Sandy and I wanted to accomplish, I would often we'd think about what a scene would what would have to happen in this scene according to the story, and then he would supply text, which I would then write the music for that text. Typically, write the music for his text, and many, well, I would say not necessarily many, how to put this, but it would happen from time to time that I would have to leave out lines or change a word here or there to make the thing flow according to the music, what I thought the musical lights were. And I was always completely delighted that Sandy would write back and say, fine. He would say, do it. What he said, that my job as a librettist is to inspire you to write music that's persuasive and convincing and beautiful. And if I've given you words that are in some way holding you back, let's fix them so that we get them right for you. Because Sandy was fully convinced, and I think he's right in this, that the best libretto cannot save a poorly composed scene musically. That in the end, it's the music that is going to have to carry the fundamental emotive and structural and whatever definition you want. It is the music that is going to have to carry forward what you want to do, the story that you want to tell. And he was great. I mean, we were sometimes working very far apart, and this was in the early days, not such early days, but early days enough so that I would set a passage and I would write back to him with the changes that I would make in his libretto, and I would await his response in the email. Sometimes I was in Australia, as I am now, and the next morning I would wait with anxiousness, get up early in the morning to see if he accepted what the changes I had made. And invariably he was sympathetic and changed. There was only a few areas where we pushed back and forth for a while.
I can imagine. Um, my next, I had a question that was pertinent to what you were saying, but I lost my train of thought. I, I guess I remember now. My question is about when there are moments in the opera where there are spoken lines, not sung. And there's one, in fact, in Jacob's song, Jacob's aria. And I was wondering what leads you to determine where they should be and how many of them do you allow yourself to use?
Well, Brett, there's actually, it turns out there's only one place it happens, and it's in your aria, in the bass aria. There is no other spoken line in the whole opera. And I did that intentionally to bring out what is in some ways what I think is one of the, not the only, but one of the core messages, if one can distill it, one of the pure content messages of the whole opera, namely that despite our best efforts as thoughtful, philosophical, psychological persons, uh, as humans, we have a hard time expressing reality in words. Uh, and to become too definitive about it is to kind of be mistaken and rigid. And in the case of poor Jacob, who's made terrible mistakes in his life, despite the fact that he's not a bad person per se, uh, he 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 feels obliged to say, even to these two younger colleagues of his, who are trying to understand what's going on with him and what happened to him, he finally has to say to them, no one knows the real truth, which turns out to be, in fact, a line that we transposed from another short story of Chekhov's into this story. The line actually comes from Chekhov's much longer short story called The Duel, in which a character who also has fallen completely in society, uh, but then kind of has pulled himself back up to become relatively successful, says to himself at the end of the duel, when he's talking to an adversary who is surprised to find that he has pulled himself back up, he mutters to himself, "No one knows the real truth." And in a sense, that's part of the great insight of Chekhov is that human behavior can be described, but sometimes its motivations and outlines are truly unknowable. Or that is to say, even when we describe them, the description is insufficient to express the complexity of what is really going on. And both Sandy and I uh, love love Chekhov, and we saw in the story that we set, uh, we saw I saw in it in particular a chance to to reflect on those kinds of questions which your aria as Jacob takes up among other ones, but takes up most directly and therefore contains that line as a spoken line.
And speaking of taking things from different Chekhov stories, in reading the Chekhov story, I discovered that Jacob's, I don't know if subplot is the correct term, but his relationship with Hannah doesn't exist in the original short story, which led me to wonder where it came from and why you chose to include it in the opera.
Well, uh, I mean, the answer is very prosaic, but it works. It's there's a sort of logic to it. In the original story, Jacob is not a professor. He's kind of a character who lives in the village, and he's a kind of a strange person that people don't really understand what he's all about. And he has terrible social problems, but that's all we know about him. Although he does play an important part there too in the original story, which we should mention is originally known in the Russian word strach, which means terror, and it's only the subtitle, My Friend's Story, where we get our title from. We both felt, by the way, this is a little aside, we both felt that the word terror was just not an adequate translation of what the Russian is and would lead people to assume it had something to do with terrorism or so, things that have absolutely nothing to do with the story. So that's why we called it My Friend's Story. And I can come back to some of the interesting things that result from that change. But in terms of the character of Jacob, in the original there's only one significant female role, and that's the wife of the friend's friend. Um, and we wanted a diversity of voices, and this way it gave me a wonderful palette uh, and a chance to create a completely independent character who could sing and whose role in the opera is as a singer, actually, which of course is not unique to my opera. Rossini does this it happens in Mozart, happens in any number of things. But it was an easy way to do that. Um, and yeah, so now we have two particular female figures, both very important, who play consequential roles um, in the opera. And that's why she's there. She is there in a way to illuminate part of the failures of Jacob to be the loving and protective father that he wanted to be, um, and at the same time also to have it gives her a chance to interact with the two primary figures, Peter and his friend, who remains, interestingly enough, and this brings us to the other interesting thing I think about the story is that the person who tells the story, who is narrative thread, leads us through the whole thing, is never identified by name. We never discover what his name is. He's just the friend of Peter, even though he carries the burden of the story. And yeah, so that's an interesting thing we can talk about if you wish it and when you're ready.
Of course, I just it, talking about Hannah reminded me of another of my questions, though. But if you'd like to continue along that line,
Let's to go with Hannah. That's a nice thing.
well, I'm forgive me if I'm not using the correct terminology since I received private instruction in voice. I don't have a very strong theory background, but a lot of the opera is written in I would call it a chromatic style, or a lot of
Well,
the
you called it chromatic in a note to me. I wouldn't say it's chromatic. It does move its tonal basis from
Mhm,
place to place more than you would see in a Mozart opera or perhaps perhaps in Gounod or something like that. But if you look closely at it, it's actually it's the descendant of probably Janacek, Puccini, Strauss. It has
mhm.
something to do with that. And only Strauss of those three final person, well, Debussy as well. Only Strauss really is really what I would say chromatic, and that's only in a few works. He doesn't do that all the time. So, yeah, I think of my work as uh, it shifts tonal centers, but it isn't. But the vocal lines are not particularly chromatic. They're not even chromatic like Wagnerian lines can be chromatic. They tend to be kind of a modal diatonic line,
Hmm.
which once you understand where the starting point and end point of that modal shape is, the, it's often very stepwise in character. There's leaps, but they find themselves they they're not they're not particularly appoggiatura like in their chromaticism, in their use of dissonance and resolution. They work in a different way.
Well,
So,
with
but you were asking about Hannah. I was wondering because she does sing a folk song in the
mhm.
end. Well, she sings a counter melody to a very famous folk song.
Hmm. I wasn't
Yeah,
aware of that. I was.
yeah. Well, yeah. Have a look when you get a chance. There's a song called "The Water Is Wide,"
Mhm.
uh, which is Whaley Whaley. It's actually that The Water Is Wide is a 200-year-old updating of a much older song called Whaley Whaley. And Whaley Whaley is just Wally, Wally. So it's kind of an earlier English form. Uh, and Hannah sings a from the very beginning to the end of her big aria, she sings a counter melody to that song, which when the men join her, they sing that song against her song.
I see.
Uh, yeah, and that is probably the most, because it is a folk song and a folk song adaptation, it's probably the most diatonic and tonally focused moment in the opera. And of course, because she's a singer in the story, it's not that surprising that she would,
Mhm.
in this role in the bar, that she's a singer, sing a folk song in a key like G, as she does, or A, I forget what it is.
It was G.
G, yeah, okay. There you go.
Yeah, I just remembered being very struck by hearing unabashed G major in the middle of the opera.
Yeah, yes, it's meant to stand out, but it's meant to also it gives me a chance to do something too, I mean, I think vocal music for me is really singable music. And I didn't want the vocal lines to be another version of some instrumental line.
Hmm.
When somebody is singing, I want you to know that it comes out of a song-like place. It's not, even though there's a lot of what I would call recitativo parlando in a similar way that Janacek or Debussy would do. When it does occur, I want it to feel song-like.
Hmm.
So yeah, so there's always I mean, it doesn't completely. there are certain vocal parts, I think, in certain modern operas that are basically an instrumental line, just that somebody is singing it. And I never wanted to do that, so I tried not to.
And I think that's, if not most apparent, at least very apparent in Jacob's aria, where there's a polyrhythm, which I wrote you about. The the accompaniment is in 5/6, but Jacob is singing in 3/4. And I just thought that was very interesting. And uh, according to
Well,
Zoom, I'm running out of time, but
okay, I'll just quickly say about that. Some of those polymetric moments are designed, as you quite correctly said, to allow the vocal line to find its own rhythmic naturalness above a harmonic bass. And that bass has the character of something that's sometimes simply ornamental, sometimes more dynamic, but to allow these interweaving of lines to coexist in a way that supports them both in a naturally flowing manner. They're not meant to trip anybody up. I don't think they're particularly demanding once you get used to them. They just flow along. Yeah, so I'm glad you noticed it, but I'm also glad that you're comfortable now thinking about it as a vocal line floating in its own natural speech pattern against a harmonic world that is also waving and moving in its own way.
it it has its own melody, but it reminds me of an ostinato bass a little bit.
Well, you mean in in the orchestral part, in the rhythm, the
Yes,
instrumental part. Yeah, well, I mean, again, I mean, you don't have to look too far to hear that in Janacek's House of the Dead or Macropolis Case or almost anything that he did. Um, yeah, it has there are ostinati repetitive things that do happen in that way. That has also a special meaning in the opera, which we don't have time to go into at this moment. But if we had more time, I'd be happy to talk about.
I'd love to hear it, honestly.
Okay.
But just to close out the interview, I'm wondering if there were any works that you would consider the ones you're most proud of.
Well, let me put it slightly differently, if I would. Let me return it to this opera question. I mean, writing the opera was one of the first and last stages of an opening a door for me into a different way of thinking about writing music than I had done. I was moving in that direction, but that opera really was a chance for me to fully explore that and to move into that space. And namely that when you write an opera, it seems to me, to do it well, you have to really give yourself to the story, the dramatic character, the characters themselves, the whole mise en scène. You have to throw yourself into it passionately, and you should not let anything restrain you from making vivid those important things that you want to get across. Which means that when you write instrumental music, you can be more circumspect and philosophical and have funny little compositional games all over the place if you want to. But when you look at it seems to me, when you look at some of the truly great operatic music, you can see how the composers they didn't leave anything in the dressing room. They just laid it out there, what it is they want you to understand. So there's no time for that kind of contrapunctus thing that you do find in more instrumental music, which is not to say that there are great exceptions. You know, obviously, Alban Berg's Wozzeck and Lulu come to mind, but they are very exceptional. You know, if you when you look at the great 20th century works like Bartok's Bluebeard's Castle and other pieces, Bartok was a very thoughtful intellectual composer. Nevertheless, even though there's important structural and architectonic qualities, when he's doing a scene, he's going to give himself to those scenes ferociously. And talk about ostinatos. The ostinatos in Bluebeard's Castle are very influential to me in which was in my own writing.
And I had another question, but I think that probably would be beyond the scope of the interview, unfortunately.
Well, try me. Give me a, maybe I'll give you a short answer. Let's see how I do.
Just when, learning this piece, there wasn't anything I could point to and say, this is Wagner or this is Britten, but there were things that reminded me of certain passages from Wagner or Britten or any other composer. And I just got me thinking about the idea of, the Jungian idea of the collective unconsciousness and to what extent, like, this manifests in music, if there are certain motifs that you think of as associated with different human experiences that just emerge universally among composers.
Well, I think the way you have formulated the question has already provided your answer. Namely, people have been writing music and singing, or well, just singing music for thousands and thousands of years, well before the current era. They were already doing that, and in many different cultures. And the range and expressiveness of the human voice is finite to a point. I mean, it is certainly some people can sing higher, some people can sing lower, but it mostly falls into a certain space. And for any individual singer to make expressive some deeply felt emotion, there are certain things that are going to come out of their chests and vocal cords that are going to remind you of things. I mean, I'm not particularly a Wagnerian, and although people have talked about Britain to me, but as I've indicated, those are not two particularly composers in that area that I think great, but they're not my forebears. Nevertheless, it's not surprising to me that you find these places of memory of some previous kind of thing. Uh, and this is maybe a good way to conclude this, to say that one of the models for this, which you didn't mention, but you might want to go back and look at again, the model of the bass aria in some ways is Sarastro from the Magic Flute,
Hmm.
except your Sarastro is a fallen Sarastro, not the Sarastro noble Masonic leader of a great cult, but actually somebody who should have been a leader of a great cult, but who has, from his own weakness, fallen on very hard times and is a broken Sarastro. And when we cast the part in the first place and we hired Ryan Allen, who I thought was wonderful in the role, we wanted him to do Sarastro as if he was just trying to recover from a 3-day bender or drug problem. And when he was able to do that, we really felt the pathos of his disappointments in life and how he had a much more noble future in mind for himself and for his child. And yet he still retained some of that great nobility in his caring for his child, as Sarastro cares for the children, Tamino and Pamina in the Magic Flute. Um, yeah, so there's your target. You go out and have a few beers and try to sing Sarastro and see how you do.
Yeah, in my case, the beers might help, but I guess it's worth noting that in both Zoroastro and in Jacob's aria, there is an appeal to a greater power with Jacob. It's the stars, Zoroastro, it's the gods, Isis and Osiris.
Yeah,
And the vocal ranges also happen to be very similar, but that makes sense when
not
you're writing for
by
the piece.
design, I have to say, by design.
But I appreciate that you put your low F, well, F sharp at the beginning rather than at the end.
My pleasure. Well, I mean, what is so wonderful about that moment from my point of view is that when the music basically stops to allow the bass to articulate that low resonance, and you're not fighting anybody to in the orchestra to get there. Uh, suddenly the profundity and sorrow of that character is encapsulated in that opening entry in which he shows just who he is and in some ways who he was.
I think with that, we're probably out of time. And of course, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Have a great cold day there back in the US, and You know that we're enjoying the warm summer here in Australia right now.
I can imagine. I've never been, but
Yeah.
hopefully one day.
Yeah.